about a week or two ago, we finally got the video footage from the body cams of 3 of the 4 officers, former officers, who have now been charged in the case. One with second-degree murder, and the others are accomplices to second-degree murder. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the actual most outrageous part of the body cam video is the media's coverage of the release of the video, or their lack of coverage, because almost everything I read or saw about this footage was that the footage confirmed the guilt of the officers and ratified or validated the narrative of racist cops murdering George Floyd. Not only did the video not do this, it actually provided pretty conclusive evidence of the opposite. It basically blows apart the narrative. Remember, the narrative here that sparked all the riots and the Black Lives Matter protests is that these racist white cops, even though one of them was black and one was Asian, murdered George Floyd because he was black. And that this murder merely confirmed the systemic racism, right, that we've always known was there. And this just exposed it, put it out in the open. And now we need an immediate policy response, right? We need action to reduce the wealth inequality that is the result of systemic racism that was now on full display with the murder of George Floyd. Except here are the 2 things that I think you can conclusively conclude once you watch the body cam. And again, don't accept my word for it. Watch it for yourself, because after all, that's what the jury is going to do. So watch it and then come to your own conclusions. But here are the 2 conclusions that I came to. The first one is that there's absolutely nothing about the George Floyd incident that is racial, meaning that the officers were not motivated by George Floyd's race. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that they would have acted any differently had the circumstances been identical, but George Floyd been white. In fact, not only is there no racial slurs, right, spoken by any of these officers at any time on any of these videos, but nobody even mentions George Floyd's race. It doesn't even come up. They don't even say black man. So I don't know how you can conclude that something is racially motivated when the individual's race never even comes up in conversation at any point during the video. So that's number one, that it's not racial. But number 2, what's even more important is, in my mind, the videos show that none of these 4 policemen intended to kill George Floyd. And that includes Chauvin, the guy who held his knee on Floyd's neck, right, for 9 minutes. The video does not show that Chauvin intended to kill Floyd. Even if he did, it was not intentional. And intent is a crucial element necessary to get a conviction of second-degree murder. And if Chauvin did not intend to kill Floyd, then he did not commit second-degree murder, and then the other officers cannot be accomplices to a murder that didn't take place. Now, I know just about everyone was rightly outraged, right, when they saw the cell phone video, which clearly shows Chauvin, right, he's kneeling on the neck of George Floyd. He is ignoring George Floyd's repeated pleas that he cannot breathe, right? And Chauvin keeps his knee on his neck, even though he's saying he can't breathe. And then even after Floyd becomes non-responsive, Chauvin just leaves his knee on Floyd's neck. So if you just look at that, it looks like Chauvin has deliberately murdered Floyd in plain view of multiple witnesses and knowing that the murder is being captured on video. Now, it doesn't make sense that with all these witnesses and video evidence that he would do that, but people jump to that conclusion just based on how bad it looked. But once you actually see what transpired before the cell phone video starts, then you have the entire thing in its proper context. Then you understand what happened, and more importantly, why the police, including Chauvin, acted the way they did. If you go back to the very beginning, when Floyd first encountered the police, his behavior was erratic. And in fact, it even got more erratic as the encounter progressed. The entire time, right, Floyd is resisting arrest. But if you actually look at what he's saying and doing, I don't even think that Floyd realizes that he's resisting arrest. I mean, he thinks he's cooperating, but the police keep reminding him that he's resisting. And when you watch it, it's clear that he's resisting, but it's also kind of clear that he doesn't realize it. And, you really can't help but feel sorry for George Floyd in this situation. I mean, especially knowing the final outcome. But even forgetting about the fact that he died, I mean, you can see that he doesn't realize what he's doing. And at the same time, he is complaining about all sorts of problems. He's telling the officers, and this is early on, right, that his stomach hurts, that his neck hurts, that everything hurts, right? He's in pain everywhere, right? This is long before he's on the ground with a knee on his neck. He's complaining. One of the officers actually observes that he's foaming at the mouth. And the most important complaint is that Floyd says he can't breathe. He's having trouble breathing. In fact, I think he complained to the officers that he could not breathe 6 times before he ended up on the ground with a knee on his neck. And in fact, the police, they originally struggled to get Floyd to sit in the back seat of the squad car. That's where they wanted him. But as they were trying to push him in there, and even after he got in there, he was complaining that he was claustrophobic, but he was also complaining that he could not breathe. He told the officers while he was sitting in the back of the squad car with no, officers' body parts on his neck, right? He said he could not breathe. And he also mentioned that one of the reasons he couldn't breathe was because he had just gotten over COVID. Anyway, he ended up pushing his way out of the squad car. He left from the opposite side that he entered from. And after he gets out of the squad car, he again complains to the police while he's standing up that he can't breathe. And he actually asked the police officers to put him on the ground because he could not breathe. He wanted to be on the ground. Now, you might think, okay, well, he wanted to be on the ground, but that's no excuse for Chauvin to have put his knee on his neck. Until you actually look at the Minneapolis police training materials, which the defense team has pointed out, actually contains a description, including a photo, of how to deal with an uncooperative suspect who's in handcuffs. And if you look at the picture, you'll see the suspect lying face down with his hands cuffed behind his back and the officer kneeling on his neck. So that was the proper police procedure. Now, you can argue that the police procedure was wrong and that the chief of police should have changed it sooner, who, by the way, happens to be black, the chief of police in Minneapolis. But that is what the officer was supposed to do. Now, you might think, but why would you keep your knee on somebody's neck when they're complaining they can't breathe? Well, if they were complaining that they couldn't breathe long before you put your knee on their neck, well, then maybe you would believe that the failure to breathe had nothing to do with the knee on the neck. And after all, that was the original finding of the very first autopsy that was performed on Floyd. According to that autopsy, the knee on the neck had nothing to do with Floyd's death, that he did not die of asphyxiation, and there were no injuries. There were no bruises on his neck. And if this is a proper police procedure, I'm sure that the officer in question was not providing enough force on Floyd's neck that would stop him from breathing. And in fact, even as he is complaining that he can't breathe, the police are reminding him that he can talk, They're saying you don't have any problem talking, therefore you must be able to breathe. And since Floyd had repeatedly claimed that he couldn't breathe even when he was seated in the police car, it makes sense that the officers did not believe that it was the knee to the neck that was responsible for his breathing problems when he had those same problems when there was no knee on his neck. So the question you might want to ask, and obviously a question that is going to be posed to the jury, is if Chauvin's knee on Floyd's neck is not what killed him, if he didn't suffocate from pressure on his neck, why was he complaining that he could not breathe, and why did he die? And the most obvious answer to that question, if you watch the body cam footage and you look at the autopsy, the conclusion is that Floyd died from a drug overdose, that he did have cardiac arrest that resulted from an overdose of drugs, probably complicated by the stress of the arrest and resisting arrest. But if you look at it, it's quite possible that Floyd would have died of that drug overdose even had he remained in the back of the squad car where he was initially placed by the police. In fact, it's very possible that he would have died at some point that day from a drug overdose, even if he never encountered the police, that the police encounter accelerated the death, but it's certainly possible that Floyd had already killed himself, that he had already consumed enough drugs to seal his own fate, regardless of any encounters that he may have had with the police. If you read the report from the police, the autopsy, Floyd had fentanyl, amphetamines, morphine, marijuana, and alcohol in his system when he died. And in fact, he had 3 times the lethal dosage of fentanyl in his body. In other words, he had consumed triple the amount that would kill somebody. That's how much fentanyl he had in his system. And in fact, if you read what the symptoms of a fentanyl overdose are, that's exactly what Floyd was exhibiting. You have a shutdown of your nervous system, which may explain all the pain that he was experiencing, cardiac arrest, and respiratory failure. So it's probably not because he couldn't breathe because of his neck. It was the effect of the fentanyl overdose that created the respiratory failure. And in fact, if you actually look at the body cam footage, you can see what appears to be a white tablet in Floyd's mouth on the back of his tongue when he was arrested, and that he eventually swallows during that initial encounter with the police. So it looks like he was actually doing drugs in the car just prior to his arrest. That's how much drugs this guy had in his system. That's why he was behaving the way he was. That's why he thought he was cooperating even as he was resisting. It was the drugs in his system that were responsible for that erratic behavior. And in addition to being on drugs, this guy had a lot of health issues. First of all, according to the autopsy, he had a severe heart disease, he had hypertension, and he even had COVID.